these celebrities.
Oh, I know. They all got
They
their.
can't call them tequila.
It's going.
So here's the deal.
Okay.
As you get older, do you drink more? I do. I've never drank so much in my life.
think
I
that's how
enjoy
you
a
start
drink in the
the video.
evening.
I drink, but I don't. I think I probably drink less. You know, and it doesn't. And I'll have maybe on average a martini
A day?
a week.
A week?
I had
See,
one
I
yesterday.
drink more than that.
And
I never did.
maybe the most I've ever drank was 2 or 3 martinis a week. So I guess I'm drinking less hard liquor, but
Well, martini's hard liquor, isn't it? I mean, it ain't
yeah,
whiskey, but it's hard liquor.
It's hard liquor. I'm not a great beer fan.
What?
Where's the key to your truck?
I'm
She's
just
gonna
going to
move your
back
truck.
it out so I
Oh,
can get
absolutely. Absolutely.
Take a spin in it around the block.
Go
Who's
get
that?
it- get
Who's
us a-
that lady
get
in
us a
that white
keg of beer
pickup
and-
truck
and we'll spend the night.
with that cowboy hat on?
Okay, you guys are on. This is it. This is happening. We're here at last.
So, what you gonna do your intro again?
Yeah, I can do that.
Stan Sanders and Rich Lindcourt, 2024.
So, I'm Richard Lindcourt. This is my former roommate at Whittier College of 60 years ago, Stan Sanders. We're at his house. We're in the garden, and we've decided to do this. And I kind of would like to explain what we're trying to accomplish here. My dad was born in 1898 in Springfield, Massachusetts. And his parents, Eugene and Carrie, were born in 1870 something. That's about 150 years ago. And I have a few pictures of them. I have a little bit of writing of them, but that's all I have of them. And it occurred to me that it would be so fantastic if in say 1900 they would have been able to photograph themselves and record themselves and talk about what life was like in the 1870s. But that wasn't possible. The technology just wasn't there. But it's here now, and I'm looking at it right in front of me. And the purpose of this whole thing is not for my family who's alive today necessarily, but more importantly for those yet to come. My daughter and son have two girls, and they're going to have children, maybe boys and girls, and maybe those kids will have children. And I think it would be fascinating to them to know what life was like in the 1940s, because we're old enough to remember the 1940s. We lived it. We know about Pearl Harbor. We know about all kinds of stuff, and it's way, way different than it is today in 2024. So the purpose is to simply put this together and make it available to whoever may want to see it. And so that's the purpose of what we're doing. Stan, can you add to that? I don't know.
Well, I can add a lot to it, just by way of background. Our parents, my mother and father, were also born in the 1890s. My father was born in 1895 in a one-stop town in East Texas, 12 miles south of Marshall, Texas, called Elysian Fields, which in French translates as the Champs-Élysées. And my mother was born 2 years later in a small town in South Texas, between San Antonio and Laredo, called McGill. It's now called Charlotte, Texas. At least that's the post office box for what was McGill, Texas. They migrated separately with their respective families from East Texas for my father, South Texas for my mom, to Los Angeles during the so-called Great Migration, which was a movement of former enslaved people, African Americans, out of the American South to the North. Northern cities such as Chicago, New York, Washington, D.C., and most notably Los Angeles for those African Americans in post-World War I migrating out of Texas. For the most part, if you were an African American in those times, you came to California. You came to Southern California, and you came to Northern California. The northern migration, the Northern California migration, tends to be a little later because it's a war preparation, a World War II preparation population that was coming out of Texas and West Louisiana to get in the armaments industry in Oakland and the Bay Area because of Lend-Lease. We started heavy military manufacturing, and because of Pearl Harbor in December of 1941, we started really total mobilization, which took manpower, and so there was an incentive for those formerly enslaved people who weren't doing that well in rural Texas and western Louisiana to come to California. That's where my mother and my father met in Los Angeles in 1925. Had 5 children within a 12-year period, and raised that family in a community then called Watts, which was almost nearly adjacent to a community that we called HP or Huntington Park, where Rich's family settled when his dad came out from Springfield, Mass, and so forth and so on. So and what we want to do in this discussion is not only talk about those backgrounds, but also compare and contrast. You know, what is, for example, the features of growing up in Watts that were like the features in Huntington Park, and contrast what was different between Huntington Park and Watts.
So close
particularly
together,
in the
but
40s
so
and the
different
50s.
because
Very close
Yeah.
together, separated by an invisible line of demarcation called Alameda, which ran from the harbor in San Pedro all the way to the freight yards of northeast Los Angeles. And it's still there. The communities are still there, but they look very different now. And we're going to be taking a road trip to HP and to Watts and pointing out some of the notable features of our childhood. So this is going to be an odyssey and an adventure. So relax, sit back, get a box of popcorn, and listen to what we have to say.
So probably, I was born in 1941, and that's a date that, how did Roosevelt put it? A day that will live in infamy was December 7th of that year, 41. That was when the Japanese pretty much sunk our U.S. Pacific Fleet in Oahu, Hawaii. And people were so upset about that. They lined up to enlist. There was no draft. People wanted to get even with what had happened there. And I say that because in those days, Long Beach and Huntington Park and all of these places were full of soldiers, full of Navy, Marines, Army. And my dad and my brother was 17 years older than I am. And my dad and my brother would go down on Tweedy Boulevard in Southgate, just a few miles from Huntington Park, and they'd go to the bars down there, and they would bring soldiers home. Strangers, someone who has never been to my house. Now, my mom was a great cook, and they would spend the night. They would spend 2 or 3 nights, and they became my playmates. I was just a little guy in those days, and I can remember one called Tubby, and I can remember a whole bunch of them, and they were my playmates, and that's what happened in those days. It was very customary. It would be very different today, I think, but in those days, that's the way it was. We lived on Walnut Street. We rented. Grandparents lived over the garage in the backyard, and then my parents bought a house on Olive Street. Now, the house they bought on Olive Street was five houses from Salt Lake Avenue. And Salt Lake Avenue, right along there, came a big train, were train tracks. And as a 5-year-old, you can just imagine when you could hear that train coming down that track. I was at the front door. I don't care what I was doing. If the train was coming, I wanted to see the train. And in those days, you'd see a train, and it wasn't necessarily freight train. It was a troop train. And there were guys kind of looking out the windows and so forth, and I can remember those trains going down the track. And later it was freight trains, and so that was Olive Street. My folks bought an old farmhouse. They bought a vacant lot. Now, my dad was a self-professed builder, and he added on 2 bedrooms, I think just 2 bedrooms, to the old farmhouse. And it didn't. The peak of the roof on what he built was like this, and the peak of the roof on the farmhouse was like this. And the farmhouse was so old, the roof was kind of caved in. Now, all the soil was sand. And I remember an open window, and we pulled the boards up off the floor of the house, and we shoveled sand out of the house because the house was resting on the sand. Later on, in 1952, we built a house. It cost $7,500 to build a house. Today, I live in a house that's nicer than that house, but it's not $1,500,000 nicer than that house, because what cost $10,000 in 1952, today my house would sell for $1,500,000. And it's not it's a nice house, but there's houses that cost a whole lot more than that. So that's a change that has happened in about 70 years.
What was
Sorry, I'm going to pause you guys for a second. We can edit this out. Something's up with your phone. It was fully charged, but it just went black, like just now, like it stopped recording. So
Okay.
I'm going to fiddle with it. And
Well, here, let me have it. I don't know why it would do that.
I mean, look at the battery, make sure the battery
Well-
is fully charged. And
88%.
okay, so I'm gonna go in and try and fiddle with the shut off, the auto shut off, because it was videotaping and it just stopped. So let me
Okay.
let me go into your settings and try and see if I can make that better. Settings. Is it possible the storage is full on your phone? Do you ever find that your phone says?
Well, don't you have? I have something over there that's.
Well, it first has to go onto your phone.
Oh, it
and
does?
Then we dump it onto
Well.
So maybe it's a storage issue, but let's try. Let's just try again. We got everything. You know. I mean,
To that point?
to that point?
Oh, good. I think better when the phone's off.
Of course.
You're a damn lawyer. You got me. You got an advantage over me.
Not much.
Okay, proceed.
So one of the questions I have,
Yeah.
which strikes me as really of interest, is were there a lot of vacant lots in Huntington Park in 1952?
Yeah.
I mean, that you could play on, that you could fly kites on, that you could pick up football, touch football games on.
There, I could throw a rock and hit 2 vacant lots from my front yard. One was, yeah. Today they're full. As a matter of fact, in those days, nobody parked on the street. Today, the streets are full of cars and the driveways are full of cars because the house that we lived in at that time has become a place that is less expensive. And families that don't have a lot of money, they buy those homes and they fill the bedrooms with people, and there's just too dang many cars, so it's just chucked full. Back in those days, in the 40s, refrigerators were replacing ice boxes. So in those days, a lot of people on the street cooled their food with ice, not refrigeration. And there was a thing called the Union Ice Truck, and it was blue, and it would come down the street, and a guy would get out of the truck, and he had it looked kind of like rubber overalls on or apron on, and he would have tongs, and he would carry ice into the house, and that's how people refrigerated in big blocks of ice
and put them in the bottom of the ice box
in the 1940s.
Yeah. I still refer to refrigerators as ice boxes. It just involuntarily out there. But one of the things, and I think one of the fascinating things about my childhood is that we lived on Compton Avenue, which was in the city of Los Angeles. There's also a Compton Boulevard, which is wholly within the city of Compton. The Compton Avenue, often confused with Compton Boulevard, was a north-south street. Compton Boulevard was an east-west street. And along Compton Avenue, which ran from the city of Compton, the northern boundary of the city of Compton, all the way to mid-city Los Angeles, about the 40th 100 block, and that would be roughly from 125th Street north to about 40th Street, had a number of vacant lots. And it just occurred to me how important those vacant lots were in my life, because they were the center of a lot of playful fantasy activity. I mean, the vacant lot to the north of me was a grassy knoll, uncut, wild grass, some wildflowers, about itself an acre in size, that was just full of boogeymen. Mm-hmm. And so my older brothers and my older sisters, when they wanted to kid me or to scare the living daylights out of me, told me that the boogeyman who inhabited those tall grasses in the lot next door to our house were going to come and get me, and that I better straighten up. I better do what mommy asked me to do. Otherwise, all they had to do was stick their head out of the back door and call the boogeyman, and the boogeyman was going to come over out of those tall grasses and get me. And so, for me, the vacant lots of Watts have always had a certain mystery about them. Mm-hmm. Every time I drive by a vacant lot, particularly in Watts, that has the same physical characteristics of the lot that I grew up next to, I think of the boogeyman. But I also, and the boogeyman figured into a lot of bedtime stories, a lot of my fairy tales, the kind of things that little kids grow up on. Now and this was pre-Buck Rogers. This was pre-space travel. This was even time for Beanie.
It was radio time.
It was
at
radio
the
time.
beginning, yeah.
And so you imagined so much as a young person
You kind of had to.
into
It wasn't
places and
pictures,
things,
it was
you know.
sound.
And it was one of the things. So I was just wondering whether or not there were vacant lots in Huntington Park, and you answered the question. The other thing that was significant about the vacant lot was that, and this was a lot that was actually east of our house, in back of the houses that backed up to our house. So we had our house that fronted on Compton Avenue, and then we had houses behind us whose backyards abutted, but they fronted on May Avenue, the street over from Compton Avenue, and then there was another vacant lot. And this vacant lot was not grassy. It was always dirty. It was always just a level of dirt, but smooth, owned by one of those rail companies. And the rail company just left it blank because there was a rail yard half a block away from that. And it was noisy and not a terribly good place to live. So they left it undeveloped. Well, that particular lot was where I played my first tag football game. It was their flag football game. It was there where I flew my kite every early March, all into
For
April.
sure. Seasonal.
That was a playground
Yeah.
that had no recreation directors, no supervisors. It was free play. There were some trees
Didn't need a
off to
park.
the south of it. That was our park.
Yeah.
That was our unfunded public park that we used, and I think it's one of the sad facts about urban life today is that we're filling in all those spaces.
There are some negatives
And
to city life.
there are apartment buildings, and there are houses, and there are even buildings that have nothing but computers in them, but they're occupied, and so it cuts down on the amount of free space growing up, which I think is correlated to free thinking, to imagination, to fairy tales, to bedtime stories, to
My
those
vacant
things
lot.
that make our childhood so rich.
My vacant lot was sand. So we'd go over and we'd shovel, make a hole. We'd make a hole. And we'd spread the sand out. And then we'd get some plywood or some boards or something, and we would cover the hole that we made. And it was a hole big enough to get in, but we needed to have a roof. So you'd put a roof on, and then you'd put sand back on, and you wanted to camouflage it. So you'd go get weeds. You'd go get weeds, and you'd put it on top of your roof. Now, I think maybe we put too many weeds on it, so it still stood out. But then you'd crawl into your fort, and you'd play cowboys, or you'd play
That's right.
whatever you wanted to play,
Or war.
or all of that stuff. And then you'd have piles of sand or something, and you had your little cars. And your little cars, you made roads for your cars, you made places to park your cars, and all that sort of thing. And my dad would accumulate junk. And once, probably every 2 or 3 or 4 months, there'd be a pile of junk. And you'd call the fire department and you'd say, "I'm going to burn my junk." And so you'd have a bonfire. And when you got done with your bonfire, there were coals. And so then you'd go get potatoes, and you would wrap your potatoes in tin foil, and you'd put them in the coals. And boy, those were the best tasting potatoes. I mean, there's a difference between roasted potatoes in the coals of the trash fire and the ones out of the oven. Let me tell you, those were the best darn potatoes.
Those were baked potatoes for real. But when you said that about the little sort of bivouac that you created there, it reminded me that when we were growing up, a lot of our play was
It's in the neighborhood.
and related to war games.
Yeah.
We had little
WW2 was going on.
sawed-off
Yeah.
sticks were our rifles.
Oh, sure.
And we had these made-up helmets but we were mimicking the times
Yep,
because
that's true.
we saw relatives, we saw maybe in our case even older siblings who went off to military service.
Some didn't
Far
come
more
back.
common than now, because now you have to volunteer. It takes an affirmative act on an individual's part to join the military. Then in 1940s and the early 50s, really, in point of fact, all the way up to 1969,
There was a draft.
1970, there was a draft. It was conscripted, and you didn't have a choice. If your number was up, you had to report.
You
for
had to
service,
register.
or
They knew where you were.
at
Yeah.
at 18,
Yeah.
your birthday, on your 18th birthday, there was one very important thing you had to do. You had to register with the
18.
Selective Service Administration, the SSA, and no, the SSS, the Selective Service System, and you had to register. Every male 18-year-old, white or black, north or south, east or west, if you were a citizen of the United States and maybe even a resident of the United States, you had to register with the Selective Service Agency. And so this business of going off to the military, going off to war, even in the 40s when we were toddlers and too young to do that, was a reality that we incorporated into our games.
We absorbed it. Yeah.
And these vacant lots, these areas that were unkept with tall grasses and nobody monitoring them, were our battlefields, our mock battlefields, so that we could kind of emulate our older brothers and siblings, our older uncles and so forth, who were going off to war and coming back with war stories. We had our own war stories, about the guys down the street who we all got
Without
together.
the danger.
Yeah,
Without the danger.
and they were, we used the pejorative on some groups. Some groups were the Japs, and we were the good guys. We were the GIs. So it was the GIs versus the Japs. And now we didn't know at the time that reference to Japs was a pejorative, because we had people of Japanese descent in our community who actually were some of the most successful small proprietors, shopkeepers, grocery stores, meat cutters, produce
Let me tell you, there were those
And so
Japanese
that was-
people had businesses, they had homes, and at one point there was such a scare about whose side would they be on, that they were collected and put into camps. They lost their businesses, they lost their homes, and most of them were loyal Americans, but that sort of fear was very prevalent. My brother served in the Navy. He was in the Pacific. And when he came home, he was then shipped out to go back to Japan and be part of the occupation and be part of the Bikini bomb test. And incidentally, that war ended because we developed the atomic bomb and we used it twice in Japan. Imagine, one bomb killed 100,000 people. And today we have bombs that could do one bomb could do 10 times that damage. And it's a really, it's just a fact for today, much more advanced than it was back then. For 65 years, my brother worked in a gas station that he owned up in Julian, California, up in the mountains behind San Diego. And he had Chevrolets, and only Chevrolets, because he was not about to buy a Japanese anything. I mean, that was kind of the mindset in those days. There was a lot of guys had died in Hawaii when the Japanese bombed Hawaii. And there was a powerful resentment. Now later, Japan has become one of our great allies. But time has a way of making that happen. For my brother, Japanese cars were never going to be parked in his garage.
That was one of the mysteries of growing up. I think both in Watts and HP was that we had noticeable population of Japanese Americans who had come to this country for a better life.
Yeah.
When they came, I'm not sure. I know the Chinese came in the 1880s to work on the railroad, but they were mainly in Northern California. The Japanese came as farmers, probably
true.
around the same time, and later into the 20th century, into the early 1900s. And they did. They ran truck farms, and there we had a connection between those truck farms in the San Joaquin Valley and the Sacramento Valley, where we grew lettuce and onions and tomatoes and so forth, with those grocery stores that their urban relatives set up in Huntington Park, set up in Watts, and we bought and lived very good lives off of those organically produced products.
Fresh vegetables.
Fresh vegetables grown in the state of California and trucked to local urban markets for us to enjoy. And at one point, none of the Japanese stores that had been set up in Watts were open. They were just left. They were vacant. There was nothing on the shelves. Interestingly enough, to my knowledge, none of them were destroyed or burnt. But there was a period from roughly 1942 to 1946, 1947, when the Japanese, particularly on the coast of the Pacific Coast, in Southern California, in Watts and in Huntington Park, were arrested and confined, incarcerated, really, in
because they could
camps.
they didn't had not done anything, but they might.
And these camps were in remote areas of the Sierra. I mean, if you've ever been to Manzanar, which was the biggest one in California, really a city, thousands of Japanese citizens there who'd done nothing. They were loyal
Japanese.
American citizens. Some of them were second and third generation Americans, eligible to serve in the military, and they did. And they formed one of the fiercest fighting units in the U.S. military during World War II to fight against
the irony
against their ancestors' homeland. And so we look at that now, and we look at the cruelty and the brutality of that forced encampment, that whole thing of these
injustice
of taking Japanese citizens out of
whole families.
out
We're
of
talking
the
children. We're
civilized, out of American civilization, and putting them
with the clothes on their back and a suitcase.
Yeah, that's right, and they had nothing, and they had to start from scratch. They had to develop the soil. They had to turn the soil, till the soil. In many cases, the mountain areas and the foothills of the Sierras is not that hospitable when it comes to habitats, to humans living there. People who live in those foothill areas and in those mountain areas really are roughing it. But even then, they can drop a electric line in. In Manzanar, there was no electricity. They had to wait years before. It may be electrical service there now because they're tourist attractions. People want to come and see. But they had to live those desperate lives. And our populations, Huntington Park and Watts, dropped noticeably because our neighbors were no longer our neighbors. They were in concentration camps, as they were
Yeah,
called then.
essentially. Yeah.
Much like
Internment camps.
internment
maybe,
camps.
Yeah.
Yeah. And one of the ironies of today's life, and when you listen to doomsday fatalists talk about the various and sundry conspiracy theories, is that they always note that, those internment camps are still intact.
Yeah.
They haven't.
Yeah.
They
Yeah.
haven't been.
You can
shut
visit
down.
them.
They haven't.
Yeah,
They
just in
haven't been
case,
destroyed.
just in case.
They haven't. They haven't been repurposed.
Yeah, yeah.
And so the idea
And we have
is
politicians that would fill them.
and some politicians would fill them. I've heard proposals that we could solve our so-called undocumented problem, quote unquote, by repurposing those internment camps as detention centers for undocumented foreigners in the country.
So I can remember I want a couple of things. And now I've forgotten them here. So I'm 83. I can play that card anytime I want to. But when I was a boy, my dad had come out here and he was an accountant. And I think he had his own business early on. And he would sit at the table and he would be writing in his accounting books. And he had a mechanical, a little bitty mechanical adding machine, and he'd be going clickety click and like that, and I'd be laying on the linoleum floor listening to the radio. Gabriel Heater in the news, Sergeant Preston of the Yukon, Cisco Kid, Red Rider, Inner Sanctum, Green Hornet. And it was all radio, all radio. We didn't have television until probably 1948. And the first television I ever saw was 2 doors down from me. And it was a Mexican family who had a television that was probably this big. And the screen that you looked at was probably this big. And it was actually a cathode ray tube reflected off a mirror. So you were looking at an image and you just can't imagine. Now today we have 8-foot by 4-foot flat screens that are ending the career of theaters all over the country because they're so darn good. And that all happened in about 70 years.
How did that affect the home life of the Lincourts?
Well, here it did. I'll tell you exactly. Our first television set, well, my mom was a great cook. Minerva Lincourt, well, that's a whole other story that maybe we'll get to, but she became a great cook. Her whole life she cooked for people, and she was a uniter, not a divider. Sunday afternoon at our house, about 2 o'clock, there was either stewed chicken or there was brisket, and if you had stewed chicken, you had biscuits and you had gravy. And if you had brisket, you had potatoes and gravy. And everybody'd sit and eat together. I vividly remember as a little boy sitting watching my brother and his best friend sitting at the table. And his best friend was my sister's girlfriend, later to be wife. And they would take a bite of food, and then they'd look at each other and they'd kiss. And then they'd take another bite of food and they'd look at each other. Young love, let me tell you, young love. Now
Chewing all the time.
They ended up getting a divorce, but that was a long time later. And then when dinner was over, you had dessert. And Mom would always make a lemon pie from scratch. And she would make that lemon pie, and that's what you had on Sundays. And we enjoyed it unless there was a train coming by, and then I had to go to the door and look at the train. But then, getting back to the televisions, we had a round, I think it was a Hoffman television, because everybody was afraid that looking at that television was going to probably make you blind, or it was going to do something bad to you. So the Hoffman Company decided if they made their screen yellow and it didn't look like the other screens, it would be safer. So we'd go in and we would watch normally Hopalong Cassidy. And we'd get into a Hopalong Cassidy. Well, before I talk about that, well, no, I'll get to that. While we're watching Hopalong Cassidy on this little bitty round screen, my mom would get up, she'd go out to the kitchen. She was great. She was just great. And she'd come back with brisket sandwiches. And we would sup on the leftover brisket that we had for dinner, early dinner at 2 o'clock in the afternoon on Sunday. So that's kind of how we spent our day. It was something we did, week after week after week. And it was very special.
One of the interesting things about television then, I think, at least it was true in my household, is that we turned it on for a specific show, and then we turned it off. We didn't leave it on. It wasn't something that you turned on in the morning and then when you got up and left on all day.
And that's why you
and then
excelled
turned
and
off.
I did not excel. In my house, on Saturday, I would look at that television screen and you know what I'd see? The test pattern. Television wasn't on 24/7.
That's right.
Television was on a few hours a day.
A few hours
and there
a
was channel 2, 4, 5, 7, 9, 11, and 13. There were
13.
7 channels.
And that
now
was it.
today, there's hundreds of channels. Today, there's streaming. I just can't even go into it. But in those days, there wasn't. And television. In fact, before we had a television, we'd go down on State Street and we'd look at the appliance store, and they'd have a television on in the window, and we were. To see pictures like that remember, we had radio, and then all of a sudden we had television,
Right.
and it was fascinating. It changed everything.
And if we had televisions, we had only one.
Yes.
And that was in the principal gathering area. Sometimes it was the kitchen, but most often it was the living room,
Yes.
where everybody could have a seat.
And there was no clicker.
No clicker. You had to get up,
You get up and you turn the channel.
which was you'd have to turn the dial that was embedded in the television set itself.
And the picture might be crappy. So you went over and you adjusted
You
things so
adjusted
you
it.
could get the best picture you could get.
You had adjustments for contrast. You had adjustments for light. You had adjustments for sound.
And in those days, I don't have the right word for this. You probably do, but the fidelity was much coarser than what we see on television today. The camera that's taking these pictures right now has 1 million pixels or some darn thing. Those sets had maybe 300 or 400 lines that kept refreshing
That's right,
themselves,
right.
and that was the picture you saw, and
That's
it was
right.
all black and white.
That's right.
It was all black and white.
Right.
Yeah.
And I remember the competition amongst family members for screen time. So every day, when my dad was home, we had to watch the news.
Of course.
In the evening news, the predecessor of Walter Cronkite.
Edward R. Murrow.
I can see his face. Edward R. Murrow was one of them. I can see his face, but I can't call his name. And my father would sit and he would watch that. And so, since that was the only thing that we could watch, there was no second or third TV in my house. We all watched the news, and we watched the news reels. Sometimes 2 and 3 days after the actual events, because there was no such thing as live coverage in those days, and the live coverage that there was very rudimentary. If there was a football game being played, there were maybe a half dozen camera positions, if that. And the camera positions in today's Super Bowl productions are 34, 36 different camera positions. So watching a live football game didn't have the excitement that it has today. It was rather dull by comparison, because there was just some guys out there playing. There There was no what they call now color. There was no color commentary until color television came in, which was maybe a decade later.
In the big games now, they got cables that are going, say, 25 feet above the field from this side of the stadium to this side of the stadium, and they got a camera that they can just put any place on the field and you know, get into the backfield or get wherever they want. In
Well, now
terms of the
did
pictures they want to take.
did that absence of a television screen on that's 60 inches in width and another 48 inches.
Well, the downside
high.
of that fabulous stuff is that
What did you do?
It prevents you from doing so many other things. If the television back in the 40s is only on a few hours a day, you got to do something else with your time.
What'd you do with it?
Well, you played cars you played cars. We did spying. We were spies. In those days, there were fences between every house, and we learned how to climb fences fast, and we learned how to jump over a fence and get under a bush and see what was there. And there was a big tree back by the garage, and
What kind of
and
tree
we
was
built, and it was an elm tree, and we built a fort. And that fort had a window, that fort had a door, but that fort, it had a trap door. And it had a trap door that you could go through, come down, and go out another door. So if you needed to get out of the fort because the bad guys were coming, you'd open the trap door, you'd go down to the bottom, and you'd open it up. And I built all those things. And then we put a deck out from the fort where you could stand on. And then we'd go to the Army-Navy store. And if you've ever seen, there used to be pictures, there used to be signs, and the guy would have headphones on, and he would have something here with a microphone here, and the Navy guy with his hat on would be talking. Well, you could go buy those things. So you had a speaker up or a microphone up in the tree. You had a microphone down in the fort, and you could talk to your friend. I mean, it was big stuff. It was neat. As a matter of fact, Norm Kokritz lived next door to me, and Norm was 2 years younger than I was, and we strung a wire between my window over the top of his house and down to his window, and we could talk on our talkies.
Right.
And it was stuff like that, you know.
Things that were jerry built, they were rigged, they were contraptions.
Yeah.
We made a little later on, when we were able to go out of the house on our own, we converted things like orange crates to scooters. The electric scooters that you can jump on all over the county now. With a credit card, you can go from one end of the city on a scooter to the other. Was a real phenomenon.
Metal roller skates
compared to what we had.
You'd take the rear skate, you take the front skate, you get a 2x4, you'd put the metal front part of the roller skate on one end of the board, you'd put the other one on the other end of the board, you'd get a 7-Up box, you'd hammer the 7-Up box to the board, and then you put a couple of boards, and you could carry your cookies.
That's right.
And you had a stick across
You
because
had
those were
also-
handles.
right.
We never.
Right.
You know what I'm talking about.
And because we weren't inside looking at television. We were outside.
And that's
we were
that's the upside of the horrible fact that there was not 1,000 channels 24 hours a day. As a matter of fact, I think I kind of feel bad for. I guess that's the downside of such fabulous technology.
Yeah, and the other thing too is when I thought of that, when I thought of what we did in the absence of television, the first thing that occurred to me is that I had a conversation with at least one of my parents every day, where I would ask questions. I would tell stories. Some of them fables, about what happened to me in the vacant lot next door. made up. But nevertheless, I was relating the things that were important in my mind and in my life to somebody else. I was playing it. I was playing it off on somebody. But those conversations, especially with my mom, who spent the majority of her time in the house, in the kitchen, because she was a stay-at-home mom. My mom never worked that I can remember all of the 21 years of my life that she was on the planet. The only time that she left the house to do something in the way of work was as a poll worker. She was one of the people on our poll in our neighborhood and block who served for
Years
a
and
couple
years
of
and
decades.
years, huh?
She was an anchor of that that electoral college outlet, and we talked about things that that I'm trying to fill in the blanks today. Like what was her life like on 160 acre? What was her childhood like on a 160 acre farm or ranch in McGill, Texas? And did she have male suitors? Did she have boyfriends? Did she have there were no movie theaters? Did she ever hear Will Rogers speak? What was it like? Because she was a little girl of color, but very fair in skin, because her grandfather was white. Her mother, my grandmother Maggie, looked white, and I think my grandmother probably passed for white because our family got a what do you call it? I guess you would call it an allotment from the freehold, from the homestead office in South Texas. We got an allotment of 160 acres.
Okay.
And by the way, that 160 acres is still in the family. When they left during the Great Migration and moved to San Antonio and eventually to Santa Monica, and then my mother met my father.
Is that a
and then-
homestead?
It's a homestead, 160 acres in Frio County, Texas, and it's still in the family.
Has it always been, or did you recapture it?
It was always been
Never,
continuous
never
title
to this
from
day.
19, basically from
How is it different? If you went there
19
today, what would it look like compared to when they homesteaded?
it's brush now, but increasingly less so, because I've been there several times. The last time I went, which was during the 2020 pandemic, I took my 3 grandsons, my 2 sons of my youngest son, and my 1 son of my oldest son, and it was meant as a trip
Oh,
for
that's
Grandpa
special. Yeah,
and the next
And
generation.
you had- and there was a
I had
name
already
you
been,
had-
I had already been there with my 2 sons and my daughter.
And was your grandpa or your great grandpa? Who had title to that
The
place?
homesteader was my grandfather.
Your grandfather,
Yeah, and the property has never been probated. It's still in the J.T.
I expect
Cook,
it's going to stay that
the
way.
J.T. Cook something or
So
another.
Cook, that's your mom's side,
That's
right?
my mom's side. My mom's name was Cook. My grandfather, her father, who died at a very early age for her, and as well for him. If she was 4 years old, they did have, my mom was next to last. So when he passed away, she was maybe 5 or 6, but there were grown children. Her older siblings were in their 20s by then.
Well, I want you to know that in the last month, well, My mom's side of the family, they came from Norway. They had a farm north of the Arctic Circle, where it's dark I don't know, a lot of the year and etc. And a lot of the year, the sun never rises more than inches off the horizon. And then it's all the opposite for part of the year. But my daughter found out where that farm was. And she found out that the people who were direct descendants of my mom still live there. And by herself, she goes over and she gets as close to the farm as she can. She gets in a cab and she goes out to that. And Carrie, you got to straighten me out if I'm wrong about any of this. And she then starts walking and she kind of knows where it is. And this woman's sitting on the porch. And Carrie says to the woman, I think I might be related to you. and for how many days?
6 days.
6 days. They would not let her buy a thing. They would not allow her in a hotel. It was like family had come home. Yeah. So that was a pretty cool story. What's the name of the place?
Brandmo Farm.
Brandmo Farm, above the high. Go as far north in Alaska as you can go, and that's where this place is.
Okay.
In Norway.
Okay. And with that, is that Lapland? Is that?
Yes. The Sami, to this day, every year, the Sami in that area, they bring every spring. The river's still frozen, and every spring they bring 1,200 head of reindeer across the river, right where the farm is. I mean, it's nomadic reindeer herding.
Yeah.
To this
Very
day.
close to Russia.
Yeah. Yeah, and that was a reindeer dependent society like the West was in the 1800s
Buffalo.
with buffalo.
That's their buffalo.
Yeah, that's their buffalo.
Yeah.
Provided their pelts, their meat,
Yeah.
everything.
I want to say that to the camera here, we're both 80 years old, and you've heard about the good old days. And we're talking, I guess, about the good old days. And we have an affinity for that because that was what we experienced. And imagine with all your television sets today and all the internet today and all the social, that's your affinity. That's your affinity. You're going to have, your values are going to be shaped like that, like our values were shaped by the much more simple existence that we had. And we didn't do everything right, and everything wasn't just roses for us. I mean, I don't know whether we'll get into those kinds of things or not, but we may. But you're going to be faced with the same sort of things. And imagine, hopefully, the people who see this that are maybe 60 years out from today, maybe let's say 80 years out from today, you know, what is going to be their bias? What is going to be their good old days? It's fascinating. Life is such a miracle. When you get to be my age, life, you understand a lot, I think. Please correct me when life becomes so precious. I'm pissed off. I'm going to be gone in 5-10 years. I mean, I'm 83. This is not a complaint.
You're not living to 100 like me.
It's been a great life, but I'm upset because I want to know what AI is going to do. I want to know, are we going to solve climate change, or are we just going to let the planet die? I know that productivity is going to go like this because of AI, but you know what? There's going to be tens of millions of people without jobs. And many of them are only capable of those jobs. How are they going to live? Is there going to be a guaranteed income? I mean, or is all the wealth going to go to the few? I mean, I'm fascinated by all of it, and I want to know about it. I'm not going to know about it.
Well, but it's important to explore the roots of how we think today, and the way we do that is through what we're doing based on memory.
Yeah.
My fear is that we're going to lose the capacity to memorize within our own brains, that we're going to
It
put,
won't be necessary.
well, we'll put all of our memory in the cloud.
Yeah.
And when we want to access it, like say this video, we hit a couple of buttons, wait for the cloud to deliver us the memory that we want to recall. So what, how is that going to be, how is that memory on the cloud going to be different from a couple of 80-year-olds sitting down and encouraging and spurring each other's memory about their childhoods? I mean, I can tell you very frankly, in just the short time we've been talking, I have memorized, I have recalled from memory some events, some
that you hadn't
things
thought of in a long time.
that I hadn't maybe even ever thought of. I never thought of the relationship between some of the dreams I have today and those vacant lots, and how those vacant lots became the basis for my fantasies. And so, what if you grow up in a tenement building in the Bronx or in West Los Angeles and there is no vacant lot?